Chapter 1. A quiet arrival. The village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed that autumn morning, the rising sun casting a muted golden glow over the tidy hedges. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlor window, observed the world with her usual calm curiosity. She noted the faint wisp of chimney smoke curling from nearby cottages, the soft clop of a milk cart's horse, and Mrs. Baker's tabby cat prowling across the vicarage lawn. Yet, despite the serene scene, a subtle unease lingered in the crisp air. Miss Marple had barely finished her breakfast of lightly buttered toast when a knock came at the door. It was her dear friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her face alight with excitement and a hint of concern. "Jane," she whispered, leaning in conspiratorially, "you'll never believe the talk at the post office. There's something odd afoot, peculiar comings and goings at Maplewood Inn, just outside the village." Miss Marple smiled politely, setting her knitting aside. "Indeed," she murmured, her eyes bright with interest. Word had spread that Maplewood, in an old coaching house, now a modest hotel, was hosting an unusual assortment of guests. Mrs. Bantry, eager for a break from a humdrum day, proposed they take afternoon tea there. "Just the two of us," she said, "to see what we might uncover." Miss Marple agreed, for she always found quiet satisfaction in observing human nature, especially when something felt amiss. By 2 o'clock, the pair stood on Maplewood's ivy-clad doorstep. The inn's parlor radiated gentle charm, faded floral wallpaper, a scattering of brocade armchairs, and the faint scent of lavender polish. A kindly maid led them to a table near the window, where they ordered tea and a slice of sponge cake. Miss Marple let her gaze drift, noting details with practiced ease. By the hearth sat Colonel Moody, his stern bearing and neatly trimmed mustache betraying a military past. He held a book, but Miss Marple observed he seldom turned a page, his eyes flicking toward the door as if anticipating or perhaps dreading someone's arrival. Near the piano lounge, Mr. Roland Hamilton, silver-haired and slightly stooped, a former banker with an air of affable charm. Yet Miss Marple caught the restless tapping of his fingers. Then, a third figure drew her attention, stirring her quiet curiosity further. Miss Charlotte White, an unassuming librarian from a nearby town. Quiet, almost timid, she kept mostly to herself, but Miss Marple saw her jump every time the parlor door opened, nervous or shy. It was difficult to say. Meanwhile, bustling about was Mrs. Barrel Haywood, the inn's property, a woman of fixed smiles and a barely concealed anxiety in her eyes. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, a polite conversation sprang up between them, and Mrs. Haywood confessed with forced cheer that business at Maplewood had been a touch low. She looked anxiously at Colonel Moody. He returned her glance with a frown, then hurriedly rose and disappeared into the corridor. Mrs. Bantry's eyebrows arched a bit. It was Miss Marple who asked, "Is the Colonel quite all right?" Mrs. Haywood hesitated, fiddling with the edge of her apron. "He's had a difficult week," she offered uncertainly before hurrying away to greet a new arrival. Miss Marple's gentle gaze swept the room again. Lingering on each face something hung unspoken in the air, a shared tension or a delicate secret no one dared mention. She observed small signs: Colonel Moody's constant watch off the doorway, Mr. Hamilton's drumming fingers, Miss White's anxious posture, and Mrs. Haywood's trembling voice. Whatever the cause, it seemed all too likely that Maplewood Inn was about to become the stage for a drama of secrets, suspicions, and possibly something more troubling. And Miss Marple, with her quiet yet penetrating insight, intended to be right there in the front row, studying the cast as each played a part chapter. Two shadows at Doveco Cottage, by the soft glow of early morning light, St. Mary Mead awakened with a gentle rustle of activity. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlor window, regarded the tidy lawns and hedge with the discerning eye of one who knew every inch of the village its gossip. It's quiet joys. She sipped her tea, thoughtfully reflecting the curious events at Dovecote Cottage the previous evening, where a stifled shriek had been heard echoing through the stillness. No one seemed certain where it came from or who had uttered it, but Mary Mead's such mysteries never remained unsolved for long, determined to discover if anything truly sinister had occurred. Miss Marple ventured out into the Lyonnaise, soon encountered Mrs. Dolly Bantry, a dear friend and noted enthusiast of anything slightly scandalous. Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with excitement. "My dear Jane," she exclaimed, "people are saying that poor Miss Lavinia Brent was seen running from her own house in a dreadful state. She claimed she was startled by a prowler. You can imagine how this talk is setting tongues wagging." "I see," murmured Miss Marple, her placid tone belying the quick calculations of her mind. Miss Lavinia was by nature a timid soul, always flinching at sudden noises. Yet she was no fantasist. Some thinging noon must have frightened her. "Yes," Miss Marple continued softly, "I must have a little chat with her, if only to soothe her nerves." Their path soon crossed with that of fever, watchful Miss Hartnell, who was brimming with a fresh bit of gossip. "Good morning, Miss Marple, Miss Bantry," she said, fighting casualness. "You'll never guess Dr. Haddock was summoned to Dovecote Cottage at dawn, apparently." Miss Brent was in such a state that she nearly fainted twice after exchanging a few sympathetic remarks. Miss Marple pressed on, alone, weaving her way through the rose-hedged gardens until she reached the low stone wall surrounding Dovecote Cottage. She was struck by how ordinary everything looked. Neat flower beds, a polished knocker, and pale curtains drawn neatly aside. Only the drawn expression on Miss Brent's face, glimpsed at the window, hinted at the unrest within upon entering. Miss Marple found Miss Brent perched on the edge of an armchair, clutching a handkerchief as though it were alafly. The poor woman's voice trembled. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "I was certain. I heard footsteps in the garden last night. Then I heard that awful cry. I raced to the window, and I could have sworn I saw a figure slipping into the shadows." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on hers. There, my dear," said she. "Dr. Haddock has seen to you, I hope. Rest is the best remedy for shock." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple's gaze swept the cottage interior. Her eyes lingered on a tea tray with 2 cups, both bearing faint lipstick stains. Miss Brent lived alone. Had she entertained a visitor prior to this frightful event? Their conversation was interrupted by a light knock, and in stepped Inspector Slack, looking rather stiff and officious. He inquired briskly about any sign of forced entry. Miss Brent shook her head. "Nothing's missing, Inspector Riley. Only my peace of mind," she said, her voice tremulous. Miss Marple observed a curious flicker of relief pass across Miss Brent's features, at odds with her outward nervousness. There was more to the situation. Miss Marple felt certain than a mere fright in the dark. Perhaps a visitor had upset Miss Brent. Perhaps something was said, something unsettling enough to linger in her mind and echo as that midnight Cree bidding. "Miss Brent, farewell." Miss Marple stepped back out into the tidy lane behind the calm facade of St. Mary Mishi. Was sure a secret stirred revealed itself under her gentle but penetrating scrutiny, and as she walked home, the specter of those unseen footsteps followed, a silent reminder of that danger often lurked even amid the village's most tranquil gardens. Chapter 3. Quiet Suspicions. The morning sun streamed softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cozy drawing room, illuminating the delicate patterns upon the wallpapers. Smiled as she rose from her chair, recalling the events at Dovecote Cottage. No new alarm had disturbed the village overnight. Miss Marple sensed something simmering beneath St. Mary Mead's place the surface. She decided upon a short walk to the high street, passing the church, Chesbede, the Reverend Leonard Clement, straightening the flower arrangements by the gate. He greeted her with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Off to see Miss Brent. Are you? I hear she's quite anxious still." "Indeed. Miss Marple replied, a thoughtful crease appearing between her brows. These soon-settled nerves don't suit her. I believe a friendly visit may help her feel more resecure. Yet before Miss Marple could continue, the vicar lowered his voice. Slack dropped by earlier, he confided. He's quietly making inquiries about who might have visited Miss Brenton the night of that dreadful shriek, miss. Marple nodded, thanking him for the information. She proceeded along the cobbled path, pausing at Mrs. Price Ridley's well-tended rose bushes. The formidable lady herself appeared at the gate, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and an expression of mild disapproval. Miss Brent is too delicate, if you ask Mesh, declared without preamble, such fuss about a mere noise in the night. And now, the inspector, poking about as though there's been a murder, she gave an exaggerated sigh. Miss Marple noted the quick flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Even trifling disturbances can cause real distress, Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Marple remarked politely, especially for those inclined to nerves. She continued on her way, reflecting how Mr. Mary Mare's greatest joy and curse was its endless stream of speculation at last. Miss Marple, Aravited, Dovecote Cottage, Miss Lavinia. Brent greeted her at the threshold, hands trembling, despite her bravest smile in the parlor. A bright patchwork quilt and a profusion of dainty teacups brought cheer to the modest space. Nevertheless, Miss Brent's anxious gaze darted toward the window. More than once, after exchanging pleasantries, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation. I understand Dr. Haight came by yesterday, she said, accepting a cup of chamomile tea. I do hope you're feeling better, miss. Brent clasped her teacup tightly. Yes, he was kind though. I'm afraid my nerves aren't what they used to be. I was so certain I saw a figure in the garden that night. I cannot get the image out of my head. Softly, Miss Marple ventured Yahoo. I had a guest earlier that evening. I believe her eyes flicked ever so briefly to the side table, where a single white glove lay forgotten. Miss Brent lowered her gaze. Yes, I had a friend calling hello. At dusk, we simply discussed some parish affairs. She hesitated. I really think there's nothing more to it, miss. Marple might have accepted that, had she not noticed the faint flush crossing Miss Brent's cheeks when she spoke. Instead, she merely smiled and changed the subject, all the while storing away that small detail for later consideration. Outside, the autumn air was bright, the leaves whistling with a crisper mize of change. As Miss Marple made her way home, she found Inspector Slack waiting by her gate, notebook in hand. He greeted her with a businesslike nod. Had a report of footprints in the lane behind Dovecote Cottage, he said, frowning. Looked like a man's boots by thick size of them. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest, most curious. I wonder if Miss Brent's friend might have lingered longer than Chabelle's. She paused, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Of course, there are always others. Okay? Passing through, one never knows quite what secrets folk carry. The inspector sniffed. She's adamant thing, but nerves alone don't explain everything. He tipped his hat, strode away, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts, resting by the garden gate. Miss Marple gazed across the village rooftops. How often she had observed that seemingly ordinary people sometimes performed the most extraordinary acts born of fear, desperation, or the desire to keep up appearances. Dovecote Cottage held a secret she felt certain in, with the quiet diligence that so often served her well. She vowed to uncover it before any harm befell Miss Brent or anyone else under St. Mary Mess Peaceful Facard. Chapter for an unexpected visitor. St. Mary awoke the following day to a silvery drizzle, the sort that made the cobblestones glisten and lent the hedgy fresh dewy sheen despite the weather. Miss Marple rose early, intent on continuing her quiet investigation into the recent disturbances at Dovecote Cottage. Dressing in her sensible tweed skirt and cardigan, she set out. With her trusty umbrella, her mind brimming with possibilities. Her first stop was the village post office, run by the ever-watchful Miss Pollock, who seemed delighted to catch a glimpse of Miss Marple. Busy morning, Miss Pollock chirped, passing a handful of letters across that counter. They say Poor Miss Brent hardly slept a wink last night. I wonder what Orwell could be haunting her so. Miss Marple inclined her head, adopting a sympathetic expression. Oh, I do hope she's feeling better. One can hardly blame her for being nervous with so many odd goings on. Still, I'm sure the dear girl could do with a friendly face or two armed with her letters. Miss Marple ventured next to the greengrocer's, where she encountered Colonel Bantry, engaged in talk with Dradak. The colonel tipped his hat, politely mourning. Miss Marple, you've heard the latest, I take it. Inspector Slack paid Sprint a visit at dawn seems. He wanted to follow up on some footprints found near her back gate. Oh dear, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes darting to Dr. Haydock, whose normal-looking features were drawn in a thoughtful frown. Footprints again, but do they point to anything conclusive? Colonel, the colonel merely shrugged, though Dradak cleared his throat. Apparently not, he said quietly. Thou, Slack is convinced there's more to the matter. Miss Brent remains reticent, which only raises his suspicions. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile in return. Sometimes people withhold details out of fear or embarrassment. Doctor, that doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty of wrongdoing. Dr. Haydock nodded, yet his expression conveyed that he too suspected Sprint was withholding a secret one that could be crucial to understanding this unsettling chain of events. Leaving the shop, Miss Marple decided to visit Miss Brent directly. The drizzle had lessened by then, and the scent of damp earth drifted through the cottage garden. Upon reaching Dovecote Cottage, she found the door answered, not by Miss Brent but by an unexpected visitor, a tall, dark-haired man with a stern countenance and the faintest hint of a London accent in his voice. Oh, I'm sorry, he stammered, his gaze briefly flicking to Miss Marple's inquisitive eyes. I was just leaving. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, mildly stepping aside so that he could pass. As he slipped past, she noticed the cuff of his overcoat was slightly muddied, as if he had been tramping through wet grass. The man offered a hurried nod and disappeared down the garden path. When Miss Marple stepped inside, she found Miss Brent seated in the parlor, her cheeks flushed. She looked distinctly agitated. Miss Marple, she exclaimed, forcing a smile, how very kind of you to drop by. To was just speaking with an acquaintance. A gentle tilt of Miss Marple's head betrayed her curiosity. I must confess, I'm not familiar with him, my dear. A friend from outside the village. A slight tremor ran through Miss Brent's hands as she clasped them in her lap. Something like that, she whispered. Her manner suggested she was not inclined to elaborate, sensing Brent's unease. Miss Brent's ease. Miss Marple took the seat nearest the window, affording her a discreet view of the garden. The drizzle had returned, forming little pools across the lawn as she and Miss Brent exchanged idle chat about the weather and the new rose varieties. Miss Marple's keen gaze noted small details. Half-packed vow in the corner, a recent tear stain on Miss Brent's embroidered tablecloth. Each sign hinted at underlying tension presently. Miss Brent apologized for her distracted air, explaining she had errands to run in the village. Politely, Miss Marple said her goodbyes, promising to call again soon. Stepping back out into the damp lane, she found her mind brimming with questions. Who was the mysterious drinker, and why had he visited so early in the day? Could he be the man Miss Brent had seen prowling outside, or had he come to offer her some form of assistance with each new puzzle? Miss Marple's conviction deepened that something more than idle fancy haunted Dovecote Cottage. Standing beneath her umbrella, she gazed at the shuttered windows, reflecting that in St. Mary's secrets seldom remained hidden for long, especially once Miss Jane Marles set her gentle but penetrating mind to solving them. Chapter 5. Rumors and revelations. Soft haze lay over to marry me the next morning, giving the village an almost ethereal glow. Dew glistened on every leaf, and a faint mist clung to the church spire. Miss Marple, always an early riser, took her customary stroll after breakfast, greeting neighbors as she went. Thawed, the dawn chorus of birds sounded as sweet as ever. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air. an expectation that something was about to happen. Her first call was at the vicarage, where the Reverend Leonard Clement met her in the drive, boots muddied from tending his flower beds. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his voice harboring a trace of excitement. "Have you heard our new visitor, the mysterious fellow, seen at Dovecote Cottage, was spotted at the King's Arms last night indeed." The King's Arms was the only public house in St. Mary, Me, and visitors there rarely went unnoticed. Miss Marple thanked him for the information, marveling at how quick the gossip spread. Yet she made her way to the church gardens as she had planned to deliver a small posy for the altar while adjusting the flowers in a vasish. Observed the Reverend's wife, Griselda, engaged in urgent whispers with Mrs. Bantry. Their faces bore expressions of concern and intrigue. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if they were discussing the same stranger. Next, she crossed the lane to see how Miss Lavinia Brent fared. Dovecote Cottage looked oddly for lawn shutters, still drawn at an hour when most villagers were already about their tasks. Miss Marple knocked gently and was surprised to find the door opened by a thievery gentleman she had glimpsed the previous day. This time he appeared calmer, though a faint cloud of worry still seemed to hover about him. He said, recognizing her instantly. "Miss Brent has stepped out for a moment. She asked me to remain here in her absence." His tone was carefully polite, though his posture radiated discomfort. Miss Marple's eyes swept a small entryway with practiced thoroughness, noticing a broken vase carefully wrapped in newspaper by the hall table. "I hope all is well, Drew." She let the question hang, an invitation for him to supply his name. He hesitated just a fraction of a seed can. "Squires," he replied, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Raymond Squires. I'm an old friend." There was a trace of uncertainty in his voice, which Miss Marple noted. "I see," she said gently. "I do hope Miss Brent is feeling better. Dovecote Cottage has been a place off worry these last days." Before he could reply, she added, "If you'll be so good as to inform her that I called, I would be most obliged." With that, Miss Marple stepped back into the lane, suspecting that Raymond Squires might not be entirely straightforward about his relationship with Miss Brent. Had they quarreled, or was Brent struggling with a problem financially? Perhaps that necessitated a secret arrangement, determined to glean more. Miss Marple took the path behind Dovecote Cottage, where she had heard footprints had been found. It meandered through a hedge and panned onto a small clearing here. Miss Marple crouched carefully, noting the soft earth. She discovered faint impressions in the ground, large footprints pressed deep, suggesting a heavier man than Mr. Squires, and some smaller ones, no doubt Miss Brent's. Yet there was another set, too lighter than the first boot, unmistakably not made by a dainty shoe. Could they belong to a second visitor? Tear musings were interrupted by the sound of a snapping twig. Looking up, saw Inspector Slack standing a few yards away, his notebook tucked under one arm. He regarded her with a mixture of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said briskly, "I might have known I'd find you here. You have a nose for trouble." "No mistake," smiling pleasantly, Miss Marple's. "Just observing, Inspector. Sometimes one notices more in the hush of a country lane than in a bustling parlor." Slack-eyed her suspiciously. "Let me remind you, this is official business. There have been concerns about Miss Brent's welfare and that chap Squires. Something about him doesn't quite add up indeed." "Miss Marple," replied hairexpression.com. "Do keep me informed if you learn anything new, Inspector. I'm sure we both have Miss Brent's best interests at heart." With a curt nod, Slack walked on, leaving Miss Marple with her thoughts. She turned back toward the village, the soft hush of the clearing giving way to the distant hum of midday life, and as she stepped carefully over the footprints, Miss Marple's mind filled with questions. Who else had been lurking behind the cottage? What secrets was Miss Brent concealing? And how did Raymond Squires fit into the puzzle in the gentle sunshine of St. Mary Me? The shadows of suspicion grew ever longer, yet Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, felt sure than ever that the truth would soon emerge. Chapter 6. A shimmer of doubt. Light, rain, droomed quietly on the windows of Miss Marple's neat little parlor. The next morning, lending the room a cozy warmth, undeterred by the damp niche, donned her waterproof cape and set out toward the high street, her mind fixed upon the various pieces of the puzzle surrounding Miss Brent. Somewhere amid the footprints, the broken vase, and the mysterious Raymond Squires lay a truth that Miss Marple felt was tantalizing glycolos halfway down the lane she encountered Mrs. Bantry, who waved her beneath the shelter of an old oak jane. Mrs. Bantry began in hushy excitement. "I've just come from tea with Griselda Clement," she mentioned. "Something rather peculiar, apparently. Miss Brentho's been spotted taking solitary walks quite late in the evening through that overgrown footpath near the abandoned Ed Mall. It seems most unusual for a timid woman like her." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. In mild surprise. "How curious," she replied, tucking information away. "I can't imagine Miss Brent choosing such a lonely route unless she had pressing reasons. I do hope she isn't putting herself in danger." The two women parted ways, and Miss Marple made for the post office within its snug confines. Miss Politever, the gossip, greeted her with eager chatter. "We've had a telegram this morning addressed to Miss Brent," she whispered confidentially. The sender's name was smudged, but it looked like it began with S. "Might it be from that Mr. Squire's odd business, I say?" Miss Marple accepted her own post and thanked Miss Pollitt, reflecting how a telegram might signify urgency. If it were indeed from Mr. Squires, perhaps it held a clue to the nature of his relationship with Miss Brent, yet she knew better than to plead directly knowledge. Gleaned secondhand often proved more revealing than a forced explanation. A short while later, Miss Marple braved the persistent arousal to call upon Miss Brent. The windows of Deveco Cottage glowed with lamplight, though the curtains were drawn tightly. Miss Marple rapped gently on the door. After a moment it opened to reveal Miss Brent. Pale and drawn, a slight tremor in her voice betrayed her inner turmoil. "Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile, "how kind of you to come. I've been feeling a trifle under the weather." Seated in the parlor, Miss Marple noted that the broken vase was still nowhere to be seen, and the half-packed valise she had glimpsed earlier had vanished from sight. A faint, musty smell clung to the air, as though Miss Brent had neglected her usual housekeeping routine. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "I couldn't help noticing you seemed distressed last time. Visited Ariel. Quite certain there's no trouble weighing on your mind, Miss?" Brent hesitated, her eyes flicking anxiously toward the window. "I'm sure it's nothing," she murmured, pressing her hands together. "Reverian seems so concerned about me, but I'm afraid haven't much to offer by way of an explanation." Before Miss Marple could press further, there came a sudden knock at the door. Startled, Miss Brent hurried to answer. At this time, Inspector Slack stood on the threshold, rain dripping from his hat. With his usual briskness, he announced that he was following up on reports of unusual comings and goings at the cottage. Miss Brent stiffened, while Miss Marple discreetly observed every shift in her expression. "I've had word," Slack began, "that someone was seen lurking around here after dark. I'd like to know, Miss Brent, if you've noticed anyone unwelcome." Miss Brent swallowed hard. No one," she stammered, yet a subtle tension in her posture suggested otherwise. She clutched the doorknob so tightly that her knuckles whitened with a small, polite cough. Miss Marple excused herself, sensing that Inspector Slack's interrogation might be more direct. She were absent. As she stepped out into the rain-soaked garden, she glanced back at that below window. Chapter 7. Secrets Beneath the Moonlight. A pale half-moon hung low over St. Mary Mead that evening, casting long, wavering shadows across the Lannis village. So tranquil by day, seemed cloaked in an air of expectancy. Every window concealed a watcher, and every corner held an echo of some whispered confidence. Miss Marple, ever attuned to tacit undercurrents, found herself unable to rest. She wrapped a warm shawl about her shoulders and settled in her fireside chair, thoughts drifting inevitably to Miss Lavinia Brent earlier that day. Miss Marple had spied the timid young woman hurrying along the edge of the churchyard, her expression pale and drownness. Brent had clutched her handbag tightly, as if fearful of losing something precious. Had it been merely her nerves, or was she truly guarding a secret? Miss Marple recalled how Inspector Slack had pressed her for answers, and how the mysterious Mr. Raymond Squires had arrived and departed. Such tense circumstances. Each time she turned the puzzle over in her mind, new questions arose, desiring fresh insight. Miss Marple stepped onto her porch and paused, listening to the subdued hush of the village. Night in the distance. A dog barked once, and then fell silent down. The lane, a single light burned in Bibicourt's window. Perhaps the Reverend and Griselda Clement lingered over late-night reading, yet Miss Marple's focus lay elsewhere. Dovecote Cottage, nestled in darkness with only the barest sliver of lamplight. Escaping through a gap in the curtains, summoning a quiet resolve, she strolled along. The deserted road, the moonlight, revealed footprints on the damp ground, her own footsteps from earlier visits, crisscrossed by others. As she approached his cottage, she noticed the garden gate ajar. Inside, faint rustles suggested thought. Someone moved about in the overgrown shrubbery. A cat might have made such noise, or a stealthy figure. Miss Marple's gentle heart fluttered, but she pressed on, curiosity tempered by calm determination. She was about to knock when the front door abruptly opened. There stood Mon Squires, his face taut with disc. He appeared taken back by Miss Marple's unexpected presence. Butts Withley recovered. Good evening, he managed, voice subdued. I was just leaving. Is Miss Brent quite well, miss? Marple asked, peering past him into the narrow hallway. She glimpsed scattered papers on the small side table, and a hat tossed hastily upon the coat stand. Indeed? Key replied too quickly. She's resting. I'll wash supping or settle some personal affairs. His tone hovered between politeness and desperation, as though he clung to a fragile illusion. Abnormally, Miss Marple inclined her head, stepping back so he could slip. Past here was mud splashed high on the cups of his trousers, revealing he had trodden off the path quite possibly in haste. Do give her my regards, she said softly, watching as he nearly fled down the lane, left alone. Miss Marple chose not to intrude on Miss Brent at so late an hour. Instead, she took a careful turn around the garden, discovering that a low side window stood open just wide enough for someone to enter or leave discreetly under the moon's illumination. She caught sight of footprints in the soft earth below the sill. They appeared fresh, imprinting the ground with a distinct tread. Her eyes, narrowy thoughts spinning with the implications of a secret entrance or exit. The next morning, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, resolved to seek counsel from a trusted friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, always eager to discuss anything, squeaking a ribbon promptly for tea over the gentle clink of cups and saucers. Miss Marple recounted her nighttime observations. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, concern mingling with excitement. It's most peculiar, she whispered, and Miss Brent, if only she would confide in someone. Sipping her tea, Miss Marple explained her suspicion that Miss Brent's predicament involved more than fear of a nocturnal prowler. Human nature, she said gently, often leads the most unassuming people to desperate acts when threatened or beholden to another. I'm convinced Miss Brent struggles with something that has ensnared her, and that Mr. Squires is involved. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly, but Miss Marple merely shook her head. I'd rather not speculate aloud, she murmured, not until I'm certain inside. However, her mind clicked with quiet assurance. The footprints by the window, the late-night visits, and the telegram from an unknown sender all formed a pattern. Soon, Miss Marple believed events with force, the truth to emerge, and as she bid Mrs. Bantry farewell, she felt a distinct sense that the final unraveling was close at hand, like the tightening of a thread that would snap in sudden, startling clarity. Chapter 8. Truth at the Vecklecote Cottage. To marry me awoke to a bright, clear morning, and with it a distinct air of anticipation. The mystery surrounding Miss Lavinia Brent had gripped Deville's imaginations, and whispers floated from garden fences to grocery queues. Miss Marple, as ever, greeted her neighbors politely while her mind worked over every clue, the footprints, the late-night visits, and Miss Brent's palpable fear shortly after breakfast. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, doling his hat with an air of weary frustration. "I've tried talking to Miss Brent again," said grimly, "but she refuses to speak plainly, and that fellow Squires, well, he's gone missing, at least for the moment. One of my constables saw him board the London bus last night." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully, and might one ask if he purchased a return ticket or one-way the inspector gave. A rueful shrug. The conductor only recalled him paying in haste. No mention of returning, but he left behind a few personal effects at Dovecote Cottage. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. That suggests he intended to come back, or that he left in such a rush. Could not gather everything either. Possibilities telling. Encouraged by Hercombe's insight, Inspector Slack invited Miss Marple to join him at Dovecote Cottage. The pair found Miss Brent pale, but resolved, sitting by the parlor hearth. The cottage felt strangely subdued, the curtains half drawn despoteeth. Sunshine outside. Miss Brent clutched a small envelope in her lap, her knuckles whitening around its edges. "I suppose you both ought to know," she began in a trembling voice. "Meeting Miss Marple's gentle gaze. Mr. Squires and I knew each other years ago when I was younger. He helped me out of a difficult situation. At a cost." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, and Miss Brent continued, voice faltering. "He reappeared, suddenly demanding that I repay. And when I hesitated, he threatened." She drew a shaking breath. "I allowed him to stay here, but the stress became unbearable. I thought I heard prowlers at night, but it was often just him returning late. From who knows where." She paused, eyes flicking to the hearth. "Lead Tavri, when I was ashamed." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "You might have come to us for help, miss." Brent offered a sad smile. "You don't understand. I owed him money, but worse. I feared scandal. He claimed deposits letters that could harm my reputation if revealed. I wanted to keep my past secret when the rumors spread about footsteps and screams. I panicked. I feigned ignorance, hoping everything would pass. At that moment, there was a gentle rap at the door, and in stepped Keir, Raymond Squires himself, looking contrite and exhausted. "I overheard your converse, Shanlavini," he said quietly. "The guilt's been gnawing at me. I acted cry holding those letters over you. The truth is, I lost my job in London. I needed money desperately, but I'm ashamed of what I've done." Inspector Slack moved towards him, but Miss Marple raised a hand with quiet authority. "You left in a hurry last night, Mr. Squires. Why return now?" He ran a hand through his hair. "Because I realized couldn't go through with it. I destroyed the letters. See," he produced a scorched envelope. It's from his coat pocket. The edge is singed. "I have no wish to blackmail anyone. I'm sorry, Lavinia." For a moment, silence settled over the parlor. Then Miss Brent, tears welling, whispered, I believe you. Oh, how foolish I've been letting shame rule me." Inspector Slack, though still weary, sensed the drama hadron its course. There would be consequences, likely a fine, some legal matters to address, but the threat to Miss Brent's peace of mind was over. Outside, Miss Marple stepped into the brightness of day. Pausing under the rose-arched, Inspector Slack offered a gruff note of officiation. "You had it figured out all along, didn't you?" "Not entirely," Shaddy murmured, "but human nature so often repeats itself. Fear, desperation, and secrecy can lead people to do most unfortunate things." Her voice grew gentle. Poor Miss Brent was trapped by her own sense of shame and Mr. Squire's biased desperation. Once one understands that the rest follows with the Mr. Yacht. Dovecote Cottage resolved. St. Mary Mays, tranquil air returned, though for Miss Marple, it was simply another reminder that beneath the veneer of village life's passions and regrets still brewed, and as she made her way home, she silently thanked her years of quiet observation for guiding her to the truth once more.